Hello, astronomy students, and welcome to our discussion of how the sun's path changes based on where you are on the planet. We've already spent some time talking about how the sun's path changes throughout the year from one given spot, but it turns out if you go to different places on our globe, you're going to see different things as well. And so we're going to go over that just now. Hopefully you already know about how the sun's path changes from the equinox to the solstice from sparks or from where you live. Hopefully you also understand what latitude and longitude is. Very briefly, we'll talk about those. Latitude and longitude are the lines that we use to pick where we are on our Earth, or the coordinates that we use to talk about our location on the Earth. Lines of latitude measure how far away you are from the equator. The equator has a latitude of 0. As you move north, those latitudes go up to 90. To the highest latitude you can have is a 90-degree north, right on the North Pole. Similarly, you can go south from the equator. Your latitudes increase to 90 as well, but this time towards 90 south. So 0 to 90 north, 0 to 90 south. Longitude is a measure of where you are around the globe. These are a little bit more complicated because we have to pick a 0. There's not a natural 0 like the equator, which is the center of our Earth. So we chose the prime meridian, or our 0 line of longitude, as the line going through Greenwich, England. There's a lot of debate about why. It's kind of interesting. It's worth checking out on the internet. As you move west from here, we get lines of longitude that move up or to the west. So you'd get 10 west and 90 west and 120 west and all the way around to 180 degrees of longitude. Similarly, if you move east, you get 0 and then 10 and 20 and 100 and whatever to the east as you wrap around to 180 on the other side. For our purposes in astronomy, there's very little difference if you change your longitude. Someone who's hanging out in Seattle, Washington, and someone who's hanging out in Quebec, Canada, are going to have very similar experiences in terms of what they see for the sun. And if we wrap around the Earth to Europe, they'll have similar experiences as well. And you can work your way to Asia. Again, if you're at the same latitude, no big difference. But if your latitude changes, you start to see very different things. And that's going to be our focus for the rest of today. So we want to talk about some very specific lines of latitude. Just make sure you understand them. We've already mentioned the equator with its degrees of 0 latitude, and the North and South Pole, 90 degrees north and 90 degrees south, respectively. There are also 4 other lines that are important to us: the tropics and the circles. North of the equator, we have the Tropic of Cancer, 23.5 degrees north of the equator. South of the equator, you have the Tropic of Capricorn, 23.5 degrees south of the equator. These are both really important spots, and they turn out, again, to be 23.5 degrees away from the equator. If you go farther north and farther south, you come to the Arctic Circle or the Antarctic Circle. These have values of 66.5 degrees north and 66.5 degrees south. That number, if you do a little math, is 23.5 degrees from the poles. And so again, that number 23.5 turns out to be really important. But those are the spots we're going to talk about for reference as we go through, because they're really important things that happen on special days of the year with regards to the sun on these lines. So once again, for most of our model here, we're going to be looking at this traditional dome of the sky kind of model, where for a viewer here, you're seeing what you might be seeing if you're standing in a field with no obstructions or in a boat in the middle of the ocean, with south to your right, north to your left, east inside the screen, and west towards this side of the screen. So for us here in Reno, or in Sparks, we see the sun rise in the east, go reasonably high in the sky, and set in the west on both the spring and fall equinoxes. So on these dates of the year, again, the sun rises perfectly east, doesn't go terribly high, and sets perfectly west. On different days of the year, we have different experiences. The June solstice, we know that the sun rises far north of east, goes really high in the sky, and sets north of west, and is up longer than it's down. This is represented by the orange line here. In the December solstice for us in Reno, the sun rises south of east, doesn't go very high in the sky, and sets south of west, and is down much longer than it's up. And this is represented by the gray line here. And we're going to talk about all 3 of these positions, what happens to the sun on the solstice, June or December, and what happens on the equinoxes. But we're going to start with the equinoxes. So let's begin here. Once again, here's the sun's path on the equinox from Reno. either equinox, spring or fall. So again, the sun is making an entire path, a 360-degree circle, almost 360 degrees in that 24-hour period. It's not exactly 360, and we'll talk about that in another video. But think of this as a great big hula hoop that is the path the sun makes. And think of the other hula hoop we care about as the horizon. Those two hula hoops interact in certain ways. As the sun comes above or below the horizon, that hula hoop comes above or goes below, and then the horizon stays relatively fixed. And so when we talk about the position of the sun and how it's different, it's a difference in how those hula hoops interact with one another. In Reno, this is what we see. The sun rises in the east, reasonably high, sets in the west. Here's one of your peers' videos explaining this exact process.
My name is Luis Griswold, and this is my 5th period astronomy with an A-class sunset video. So here I went to the hill that's right next to my house, and I was able to catch a few seconds worth of pictures before the sun disappeared behind the clouds.
What I hope you noticed from Luis's video is that the sun comes in at an angle where we live here. It doesn't go straight to the horizon. And that angle turns out to be really important. So as we work our way south from Reno, say we go from Reno to Mexico, the equinox sun still rises in the east and sets in the west, but its path is a little different. It turns out that angle is what changes. In Mexico, the sun actually gets higher in the sky than it does here in Reno. Again, there's Reno, there's Mexico. The sun gets higher in the sky. If we get to, say, Panama, even farther south, the sun will get even higher in the sky, to the point where the sun nearly reaches the top of the sky. Well, it turns out if we get exactly to the equator, that's exactly what happens. If you're standing on the equator on the equinox, the sun will rise in the east, go straight through zenith, and then come down straight in the west. Notice the angle the sun rises and sets at is 90 degrees. The hula hoop of the sun's path and the hula hoop of the horizon are perpendicular to one another. And that's what you would see on the equinox on the equator. So this video here, I've run it at twice the speed, is the sunrise at the equator. And like we said, this person on the equator here, on a cruise ship, should see the sun rise at a 90-degree angle and then go straight up beyond there. And certainly that's what it does. Comes up, no angle at all, to the left or the right, goes straight up perpendicular to the horizon. This is the same thing you would see when the sun sets the same time of year. So let's imagine, though, instead of going from Reno to the equator, we go from Reno north, and we work our way towards the pole. What would we see then? Well, again, here's our path in Reno, and if we start working our way north, that path, instead of getting perpendicular to the horizon, starts getting closer to the horizon. So if you were in Vancouver, Canada today on the equinox, you would have seen the sun rise in the east, go not very high in the sky, and then set exactly west, still having 12 hours above and below the horizon. If you went even farther north, say towards the top of Alaska in Barrow, you would still see the sun rise in the east and set in the west, but the hula hoop that is the path of the sun and the hula hoop that's the horizon are almost the same plane, where the sun doesn't go very high in the sky at all. To the point at which, and if you guess this, if you get all the way to the North Pole, the plane that is the hula hoop that is the horizon and the plane that's the hula hoop that's the path of the sun are the same. And believe it or not, on the equinox today, the sun on the North Pole goes completely around in a circle, starting in the east, going through the south, through the west, and the north again. And that's the path the sun makes today on the North Pole. So in this video, it's a few weeks before the equinox, so the sun isn't perfectly on the horizon, but here we are on the North Pole. The sun's a little higher, we'll talk about that later, but sure enough, it's going around in a circle, not getting any higher and not getting any lower. This is what you would see on the North Pole, very, very close to the equinox. The sun moving around, almost half up, half down, going all the way around. So let's continue to talk about that equinox sun. Let's imagine that we didn't stop at the equator, but we kept going farther south. So remember, at the equator, the equinox sun goes straight overhead. Well, if we work our way south from the equator, we see that line tips back to the north. So if, say, you're in Melbourne, Australia, the sun rises in the east, sets in the west, but as it goes up into the sky, it goes up into the northern half of the sky, not the southern half of the sky. So this is very similar to what we would see in Reno, but the sun goes through the other half of the sky. And if we keep working our way south, say towards Cape Horn, we'll see something very similar to what we would see in the far north, except in this case, again, it's going towards the north half of the sky, not the southern half. And if we were standing on the South Pole on the equinox, we would see almost exactly what we see on the North Pole, except the sun would go the opposite direction, start in the east, go through the north, then the west, all the way to the south. I know this sounds a little strange, and I know we don't understand why, and that's not the scope of our class yet, but we'll explain why this happens in our next unit. But for now, understand that this is what you see for the equinox sun as you change your position. We also see really interesting things with the solstice suns. So let's start by talking about the June solstice. The June solstice sun, again, in Reno or Sparks, rises north of east, goes high in the sky, and sets north of west. Well, if we start to make our way south towards the equator, we see the same tilting of this sun's path up towards the top of the sky. But because it's farther north and because it already went higher in the sky, we don't have to get all the way to the equator for it to get straight overhead. We just have to get to the Tropic of Cancer. On the Tropic of Cancer, on the June equinox, the sun makes it straight overhead. And so that's what defines the Tropic of Cancer. It's the farthest north you can get and still see the sun go straight overhead on one day of the year. What's that day? Again, the June solstice. If you kept working your way south and got to the equator, you would see again that the sun rises and sets perpendicular to the horizon, but this time it's 23.5 degrees north of east, doesn't quite make it through zenith, and it sets 23.5 degrees north of west. So not quite as eventful a day on the equator as the sun rising perfectly east, going straight overhead and setting in the west that you see for the equinox. But on the tropics, this is a big day. The other thing we can do, again, is go north from our location in Reno and see what happens to the June solstice sun. Again, here's our June solstice sun from Reno. If we work our way north, unsurprisingly, that path starts dropping down. Now, one thing you should notice here, though, is not only is it dropping down, but it's also increasing the time above the horizon. For someone in Vancouver, their sun doesn't go very high in the sky on the June solstice. But what it does do is it stays up way longer than it does down. So in Vancouver, in the beginning of summer in June, you're going to have a very, very long day and a very, very short night. To the point where if you move all the way up to, like, say, Anchorage, Alaska, you get an incredibly long day and a very short night on the June solstice. And if you keep going farther and farther north, those two planes start getting closer to one another. And on the Arctic Circle, the planes get so tilted that the day actually never ends. The sun never dips below the horizon. So on the Arctic Circle, on the June solstice, the sun never sets. It just touches the horizon in the point due north. This is what defines the Arctic Circle. It's where there's at least one day a year where the sun never sets. Anywhere south of it to the equator, you aren't going to see another day where the sun never sets. So what do we see? Again, here's a quick video showing that sun never setting that you experience in the far, far north. So again, looking up in the north, there's your sun, and it gets very, very close to the horizon, but it never actually sets. And this will happen for days on end if you're north of the Arctic Circle. If you're on the Arctic Circle itself, the sun will just barely not set on that one day, and every other day of the year it will. But on the Arctic Circle, the sun doesn't set. Anywhere above the Arctic Circle, we see the same thing. If you go to the North Pole, you'll see something much like we showed in the last video, where the sun now is 23.5 degrees above the horizon, and it makes a complete circle with the sun never setting. It's really neat to see. I highly recommend going up to the far north during summer months because you see this really cool stuff where the sun never goes down. So let's go back and again move south from the equator and continue this discussion. Remember that on this summer solstice or on the June solstice on the equator, the sun is in the north half of the sky and it's 23.5 degrees north of east, goes close to zenith but doesn't get there. If we keep working our way south, say to Melbourne, in Melbourne what we'll see is a sun that rises north of east, goes up to the north so doesn't get very high in the sky, and sets north of west. This sun's not going to be up very long. So people in Melbourne at this time of year are experiencing winter. In June, it's winter in Melbourne, Australia. If we keep working our way south to the Antarctic Circle, on this one day, the June solstice, it's the one day where anywhere south of there, there'll be at least a couple of days where the sun doesn't rise. And on the Antarctic Circle, on the June solstice, the sun doesn't come up at all. Here's a video of Antarctica in May, which is the fall down in Antarctica. So for them, May is very, very close to winter. And you can see the sun doesn't even come up all day long, or all night long, if you will. The winter goes on, and the night goes on almost together. So if we keep working our way down this video, you'll see it's very, very dark. Here we are in the middle of June, in the middle of the day, and the sun never even shows its face. It doesn't even look like it's light at all because the sun's so low below the horizon. If you make it all the way to the South Pole on the June solstice, the sun is actually doing its little hula hoop path below the hula hoop path that is the horizon. So it's 23.5 degrees below, or it has an altitude of negative 23.5, and it spins around down there, never showing its face. So crazy stuff when you get to the very extreme latitudes with regards to the sun. Okay, finally, the December solstice. This should be pretty easy because we already sort of understand how this works. On the December solstice, we just experience the opposite things in opposite hemispheres. So for us in Reno, the sun rises south of east, does not get very high, and sets south of west. As we work our way south from Reno, the sun will go on the equator, on the equinox, it's south of east, south of west, and doesn't reach zenith. On the Tropic of Cancer, nothing exciting. But if we make it all the way to the Tropic of Capricorn, on the December solstice, this is when the sun goes straight overhead. So if we work south of the equator, this is when we see the sun going straight overhead. If you keep working your way south, again to Melbourne, this is their summertime. So in the middle of December, this is when they experience what we would experience in June. And if you keep going south, there's that Antarctic Circle. This is the day that the sun never sets for them. So exactly the opposite of the Arctic Circle. So here's a video of that Antarctic sun flipping around the horizon here. What you'll notice is it's going the opposite direction that we're used to. But this is what we see in Antarctica. So here's 15 days of sunlight in Antarctica. Back in the winter, they paid their dues and had the sun never come up. But now they see the sun go around and around and around and not go down. And so they get a very different experience this time of year. So here comes the sun, again going the wrong direction, if you will, for us in the north. Still gets cloudy, but we saw the sun going right to left instead of left to right. All right. Again, here's the path of the sun on the December solstice from the South Pole. It's 23.5 degrees above the horizon, and it never sets. Okay, you should probably have this figured out by now, but if we move north from Reno, what would we see in December? Here we are in Reno, sun rising south of east, not getting very high in the sky, setting south of west. If we work our way to Vancouver, we see the same effect but amplified, where the sun rises in the east, sets in the west, and isn't up very long at all. If we get all the way to the Arctic Circle, we'll see the sun barely rises at all. So here's a video of sunrise at about 11 o'clock in the morning. We're way up in northern Alaska, and you'll see that sun barely comes up. It barely goes high in the sky, and then it goes right back down. So in winter in Alaska, in December or so, you barely see the sun come up at all. It's down almost all of the day. You have a very, very short day. There's noon for you. Or sorry, there's sun at 1 o'clock, which is close enough to noon with daylight savings. And then you see the sun start to work its way down. At its highest point, it's only a couple of degrees above the horizon before it starts working its way down and setting. So a very different experience than what they have in the summer. And again, as you get farther north, you get to the Arctic Circle, the sun will not rise at all on that winter solstice. And if you make it all the way to the North Pole, the sun's hula hoop is down below the horizon, 23.5 degrees. So here, just to give you an idea of the perspective difference you would have in Finland in the dead of winter and the dead of summer. On the left, you can see at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun is going down and gone, whereas it's way up in the sky and everything seems to be normal for the summertime. So winter, you get these very, very early sunsets and long periods of darkness, whereas in the summer, you get these very, very long days. And so here you are coming up at 7 o'clock at night and 8 o'clock at night, and the sun's still up in the summertime, and it's been long gone in the winter. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. So here we are at 1 or 2 a.m. and you can still see it looks like the sun just barely set in the summertime, whereas it's been long gone in the winter. You see that sunrise for us in the summer by 5 or 6 in the morning, so it's only been down for 3 or 4 hours, whereas in the winter you're still waiting for that sun that set at 11 o'clock to come back up. So very different experiences in the same place on different times of the year. All right, that concludes our presentation. Here's a picture of the midnight sun in northern Norway that I took several years ago. But it's really neat to look at these things and start to understand them. I also put together a PDF with all of those things in review, and you can check that out as well. But that was the path of the sun moving around the planet throughout the year.